Hello, everyone. Let's get started. My name is Priya Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today. In today's webinar, we wanted to share with you some important updates to medical device regulations in Mexico. Many of them are already in effect, so we wanted to inform you of that as well. For those of you who may not be familiar with RegDesk, we are a regulatory approval software. Some consider us a RIMS platform. We use machine learning and AI to help RA teams prepare and publish global technical files within hours. Our teams can also access up-to-date and concise checklists of regulatory requirements, collaborate with regional partners, track registrations, and understand the impact of change assessments. Our approach to regulatory is unique in that one that gives us and our competitors a competitive advantage. If you'd like to learn more or have specific questions, or you may want to try out the system for free for a week or two, let us know. We can schedule a separate call to discuss further. But without further ado, I want to introduce you to our leading expert from Mexico, Miguel Torres Tello. Miguel has more than 15 years of experience working as a regulatory affairs specialist. He has provided support to tens of medical device manufacturers around the world to obtain approval from COFEPRIS. He's currently the co-founder of a leading regulatory consulting company in Mexico. His firm is called Veric Consulting Services, and if you'd like to be connected to their consulting firm or to Miguel directly, please let us know and we'll make that introduction. Their firm provides regulatory affairs solutions for medical devices and IVDs, and I definitely want to point out that the consulting firm can also act as your authorized representative in Mexico. So if you need either the license holder services or any support with regulatory affairs in Mexico, please reach out to me or us, and we will then make a direct connection and introduce you to Miguel directly. Before we begin our discussion today, I'd like to turn our attention to our attendees. Once again, thank you for joining us. At the end of this meeting, we will hold a brief Q&A. We encourage your participation, so please refer to the chat button on your screen. And in the interest of time, please submit your questions throughout the course of our talk, and we'll try to address as many of your questions as we can. In case we run out of time, please email us your questions and we'll try to address them via email. Also, we'd love to get your feedback on today's webinar and ideas you may have for future webinar topics. Miguel, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you, Freya, for the invitation. Very nice to be here with you today. And thank you for everyone who are joining this webinar today.
So before we get started on discussing the recent changes, when I say recent, it's happened over the last several months, not just as current as just this month. Before we do that, there's the framework in Mexico is there's different pathways to regulatory approval. Can you please just give us a high level framework for Mexico, because there's a traditional pathway abbreviated and there may be others. And I know there are companies that have US FDA approval. How can they leverage that? So if you can please touch upon that, and then we'll dive into the recent changes.
Absolutely. So as you said, we have different pathways in Mexico. We basically have three regulatory pathways, which is the standard process or the traditional process, we can call it as well, which basically means that you submit all your paperwork to COFEPRIS, the Minister of Health in Mexico. They review the information, but they generally provide feedback in a certain period of time. Nowadays, it's taking up to 16 months to receive a response from the authority through this process. So this standard process, by the way, is the longest. We also have a second regulatory pathway, which is Equivalence Agreement Process, which is applicable for those companies who has approval by the FDA in the United States, Health Canada in Canada, or in Japan. It is worth mentioning that it is not that you are not automatically approved if you have approvals in these countries. It is also worth mentioning that products considered class 1 in Canada or Japan are not eligible for this equivalence agreement pathway in Mexico because they do not have any regulatory control in those countries if they are considered class 1. And I think the major point here to consider is that in terms of timelines compared with the traditional process, it takes up to 8 months to receive a response if you are eligible. It is also worth mentioning that this regulatory pathway, the equivalence agreement, is applicable even if you are not located in the US, Canada, or Japan. You can be a manufacturer from Germany and have approval in the FDA, so you could be eligible. But it's very important to make sure you're eligible for this process. Finally, we have the third one, which used to be the fastest regulatory pathway, which was using third-party reviewers. Nowadays, this is a key important thing to consider if you are looking to develop the Mexican market, that third-party reviewers are not longer the best option for you. We are even not recommending to work with them. This was basically an option to expedite the reviewing process in COFEPRIS. Third-party reviewers are not a new entity or an entity that only works in Mexico. There are also in other countries as well. And their role was basically to pre-review your documentation to provide a pre-approval, which was considered by the Minister of Health in Mexico or COFEPRIS to acknowledge that someone else certified by them has already reviewed that information. So that 2 years ago expedited the reviewing process, but nowadays the government is not recognizing the third-party reviewers. So up to this moment, we recommend not using this pathway. So those are basically the three main regulatory pathways, Priya.
Thank you. And we can circle back on these pathways at the end of the conversation, but first we want to discuss the recent changes to device regulations in Mexico. So there's some few key things that happened that I think it's important for foreign manufacturers to know. So can you just highlight those?
Absolutely. In the last year and a few months, there has been 4 major changes in the regulatory framework in Mexico. I will describe them in chronological order. The first one happened in November 2020, which was actually related to the Equivalence Agreement pathway we have just talked about. And basically, the authority is providing or officially stated timelines to resolve these processes. They stated that it will take 5 working days to resolve any submission through the Equivalence Agreement pathway. This happened in November 2020. On the other hand, the second major amendment happened in May 2021. That same month, 2 major regulatory updates were communicated. The first one was related to translations. Nowadays, it's not longer to translate documents from English into Spanish or to Spanish. So you can present all your technical and legal documents in English and you don't have to translate them into Spanish. It is not applicable for other languages, only for English. But even if you are a company, let's say in China, but you have translated documentation in English, you can present that as well. So in the meantime, you present document in English, it works. The second major amendment was related to renewals. It is COFEPRIS presented a new scheme to renew sanitary registrations. It is not longer necessary to renew them every 5 years. And nowadays, it's only necessary to renew it after 5 years. And after that, basically the sanitary registration does not expire. So that is also a good thing in terms of regulatory processes. And the final amendment happened last December 2021, which was related to the good manufacturing practices certificates or the Mexican norm that is based for those certifications. This is all basically applicable for those medical device manufacturers located in Mexico. But this amended norm now includes medical device warehouses. So as a medical device warehouse is located outside of Mexico, if you want to develop the Mexican market, you will mainly work with distributors. So with this new Mexican norm, now you have the medical device warehouses, in other words, distributors have to comply with this norm. So those are the major changes that happen during these years.
And then have there been any changes to submissions timeline, or the timeline's the same?
Yeah, so basically one of the first amendments related to the equivalence agreement that happened or that was announced in November 2020 stated that timelines will be 5 working days. So we at the beginning, when the Minister of Health announced these new timelines, we were skeptical about if they will comply in practice this. So in January, February, 2021, we started to submit through the equivalence agreement process several submissions, and after 3 months, we started to receive responses. But as we were expecting, this regulatory pathway is experiencing a backlog because it experienced a high demand of several manufacturers looking to have these expedited timelines. So nowadays it's taking, again, let's say 6 up to 8 months. We have been receiving responses in 5 months or 8 months, but absolutely this is still the fastest regulatory pathway. Before November 2020, before this announcement of the new timelines, it was taking at least 8 months to receive a response. Nowadays, it's faster. About the other timelines or regulatory pathways, which is basically the standard pathway, we are still experiencing the same time frame.
Are there specific types of companies that should consider these various pathways? If you had to recommend for the types of companies or the types of prior approval that they have, what would you suggest companies do? Which route is best suited?
I would say that try to go for the equivalence agreement. If you have approval in US, Canada, or Japan, just make sure that that you're eligible. If you are, go for the equivalence agreement. Nowadays is the fastest. Otherwise, your only option is the traditional or standard process. You don't have any other option. It is worth mentioning that in Mexico we have we have 4 classifications: Class 1 low risk, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3, based on the level of risk of the product. I didn't mention this, but Class 1 low risk is a very particular case because these products are not eligible for the equivalence agreement pathway, basically the standard process, but the timeline is the fastest. It takes 3 months to be approved. So if you have Class 1 low risk devices as well, and you know that, go for it. Also, the regulatory pathway is quite fast in Mexico.
And you had mentioned there was a third pathway. So what's the third pathway?
We mentioned that the third pathway is the third-party reviewers. The third-party reviewers used to be an option for companies to expedite timelines in Mexico. Nowadays, they are not working, and we are not recommending them. You can still work with them, but I mean, they are trying to sell their services, but nowadays they are not recognized by the Minister of Health, so they are not providing any sort of advantage in terms of timelines. So we want to mention that because many manufacturers end up talking with a third-party reviewer, but they don't know what are the advantages. So that is the third regulatory pathway. It's still official, but they are not providing any good advantage in terms of time.
We had heard from another expert a year or so ago about EU also being recognized as, so if you have CE mark, that'll also be recognized and you could do abbreviated pathway. Is that untrue? Is it still not being recognized?
No, probably what it was discussed at the time is that COFEPRIS is constantly working with new equivalency agreements, but Europe has been always on the target to with COFEPRIS, to develop this equivalency agreement, but it is not applicable for CE mark approved products, unfortunately.
Are there any other conversations around that to also add that for equivalency?
No, unfortunately nowadays, no. The best thing we have is this update about the timelines with the current equivalency agreement, but we don't have anything else at the moment.
Okay. And so I just want to emphasize all these changes that you mentioned, they have already gone into effect, right? Are there any other new changes that are going to go into effect this year, or, what is COVID? I guess I'll let you answer that. And then I have another question related to that.
Sure. In terms of if this update has gone into effect, for the timelines related to equivalence agreement, they did. Since at the moment they were announced in November 2020, they've gone into effect. The translations as well. Since May 2021, it is not necessary to translate from English to Spanish. You can present information in English, not necessary to translate it. And but for the renewal process, even though the process has been approved, it hasn't gone into effect yet. We are still waiting for that COFEPRIS releases certain formats to make this to practice. So it hasn't gone into effect yet. We're expecting during this year this new renewal process will go into effect. So nowadays we'll still need to renew the process in the standard way, let's say. And the last point we mentioned was related to the good manufacturing practices. Again, this is applicable for manufacturing facilities located in Mexico or warehouses located in Mexico. And I guess that for the audience, what I will recommend is just make sure that your distributor is compliant with this norm. But the good thing is that this norm will gone into effect until June 2023. So we still have time to work towards complying with that norm.
Perfect. Speaking of, COFEPRIS and their current state of mind, if you will, what can we expect this year? What's being discussed?
Absolutely. One of the things I wanted to mention regarding possible new announcement this year is related to software as a medical device. Software as a medical device is not regulated in Mexico. If we compare that in other Latin American countries like Colombia or Costa Rica, they are regulated. But in Mexico, you can sell those products nowadays. They do not have any regulation. So, but eventually, we're expecting that this year they will be regulated like in other countries as well. I think that will be the major amendment this year.
Okay. And I just questioned regarding abbreviated pathway. Is it worthwhile even for class 3 devices? I know we mentioned a lot of class 2 and class 1 does not qualify, but class 3 if you're a class 3 device with US, Canada, or Japanese approval, and you have, let's say, you had done clinical investigation of your data, does that usually carry over into Mexico, or is COFEPRIS very strict about running their own trials?
Yeah, regarding the equivalency agreement, basically, in terms of timelines, even if you are class 3, 2, or 1, let's say in the US, for which you are eligible, if you have FDA approval, timelines are respected. That are the same, at least that's the standpoint of COFEPRIS. Regarding class 3 products and their clinical trials or any other specific study that must be done locally, there are just a few products that require local tests in the country, and for which Mexico, the Mexican authorities are, let's say, are stricter because they need more information. But let's say, for example, an orthopedic implant, which is considered class 3 in Mexico. It is not necessary to present any other type of study that you have already performed in the United States, let's say. So just for your reference, those products that require a local test in Mexico are basically mainly, not all of them, but mainly related to IVD products and to a certain type of diseases like HIV, for instance, hepatitis B or C. You require to perform local tests in the country. But for the rest of medical devices, it is not necessary.
Okay, and we have a bunch of questions, so we'll address these and then I'll ask. So one of the questions is, are software as medical devices still exempted of registration? I think you answered that and it's a yes, right?
Yeah, that's correct. It is. We have, and there is a document basically listing all the products that do not require sanitary registration in Mexico, and that includes software. But as we said, we're expecting during this year this will change.
Another question, will the exemption from translation apply also to certificate of free sales, which has been done so far in both English and Spanish?
Absolutely. For example, let's say that there are certainly several legal documents that are presented in 2 languages, let's say English or Spanish. You don't have to translate that even before this announcement. But if you have any type of legal document, let's say a good manufacturing practices, certificate of free sales, any type of letter assigning a distributor, etc., you can present them in English. It is not necessary to present them in Spanish anymore or translate them from an expert translator. In the meantime, they are in English.
Okay, that's great. And then there was another question related to this. The question was regarding the exemption of translation requirements from English to Spanish. Does that also apply to official translations too? You said yes. But what about labeling? Does that apply to labeling as well?
Actually, that's a good question. There is a specific Mexican norm, the norm 137, that requires to translate the labels. And even though for the process to receive the authorization, you can present your labels without a translation, we will recommend to do it because eventually you will need to translate them into Spanish. There are several topics to discuss about labeling. I don't think it is probably the time to discuss about that today. But what I will recommend is I would say that for labels it is necessary still to translate it. I mean, that is a pretty easy document. Just as a reference, before this announcement of the translations or related to translations, the total cost of a project, of a consulting project in Mexico, we estimate that 50 to 60% was related to translations. Nowadays, you have to skip that. But I mean, if you need to translate a single label or a few labels, we still recommend to do that because eventually you will have to do it. But for the submission process, a review process to receive the authorizations, they are not needed.
Okay, this is a good question. How do you verify if a distributor or a warehouse is complying with the GMP certificate?
That's another great question. You know, the new norm about good manufacturing practices basically state that medical device warehouses, and this is applicable as well for distributors who has to own a medical device warehouse or should own a medical device warehouse authorized by COFEPRIS. How do we know they will comply with that? And this is funny because after the announcement of this new norm in December 2021, we asked to the authority how they will, the distributors, how they will show that they are complying with the norm. And they actually said that only the manufacturers has to show that compliance. That means that the authority probably didn't consider this situation because, I mean, it's a norm and you have to demonstrate or be certified to demonstrate that you comply with the norm. Apparently, it's not applicable for warehouses. We're expecting that during this year, because this norm is applicable until June 2023, probably, the authority will provide more details about it. But based on the response, at least at first glance, I would say that for Mexican distributors, it is not necessary to have a certification, but a way to know that they are complying is just asking them if they are knowledgeable of the norm and if they are placing all the SOPs and quality management system to make sure they're complying with that. You will not have any, at this moment at least, you will not have any official document stated they are complying with that.
This question, and actually I've not heard of this process, so maybe you have. It says, the question is, what is your experience with the ECA-RDM process? And is it foreseen to continue with it?
Sure.
Are you familiar? And if you are, if you can just give a quick, describe what that process is.
Absolutely, absolutely. Last, I would say that it was in August 2021, the authority provides this process, ECRDM, which was basically an option for the manufacturer or for those companies that had already submissions in COFEPRIS and had due timelines based on the official timelines to be included in this let's say temporal regulatory process. And basically the authority was compromising to release the authorizations in the next for companies. That was basically announced in August, around August 2021. It was basically a single shot, and it was not published. It was not publicly communicated. It was basically communicated to certain chambers in Mexico. We were also participating in that program. We received responses in a fast way. We still have pending submissions that we submitted through that pathway. And the authorities stated that they will communicate a similar regulatory process again. They didn't say when. And what we can say based on our experience is that the managers of that, let's say, temporal regulatory pathway are no longer working in COFEPRIS. So we are not expecting to receive a new car for this year at least.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We're at our time limit. Thank you, Miguel, for a very informative session. Really appreciate it. I'm sure our attendees appreciate it as well. For those of you, if we didn't address some of your questions, please feel free to email us the questions and we'll, or if you need an introduction to Miguel and his team, please reach out and we'll do so. Once again, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Miguel.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for your time.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.